It's easy to look around and notice everything wrong in your city. In this podcast by Every Neighborhood Partnership, join Grace and Andrew as they invite friends, activists, pastors, leaders, and city workers to discover what's good in the neighborhood. Join us for insightful conversations that will encourage you to see your city and its people in a new way.
Well, welcome to What is Good in the Neighborhood. My name is Andrew File.
Hi, I'm Grace.
And we are excited to be with you. And I think what will be our actual studio where we record. So
we finally landed.
Yes, we are now in the Padilla conference room, named after our founder, Artie Padilla. And today we have a great episode that I'm very excited about. This is work that has been deep to my understanding of Fresno, our community. And I think like pulling back the layer of how do we be part of the transformation of not only our city, but even ourselves and our identities. And so we're talking about racism in Fresno.
Wow. Just a really small, light topic today.
This is basically how we like to go. Let's go in and at it. We got some friends here in the journey. Julie Vu is over at Central Valley Community Foundation. She has been a part of this type of work for many, many years as a equity officer, doing strategies in education. She's very thoughtful, and just I think this is like really, really creative work you're doing in our city. So thank you for that. Glad to have you.
Thank you.
And then we got Jaeden Herms as also a part of the team that is helping roll out something called Facing Fresno. We'll get to what that is in a bit. But let's just start with a little intro. Tell us about who you guys are, what has brought you to Fresno, and even to this subject of like racism in Fresno, facing Fresno. Just give us a little context. Who are you?
Yeah, so I'm Julie Vu. I often don't say my last name, not because I don't like it or anything, but it's easier to say a first name. But I do think saying a last name gives context to who I am. So I'm a Hmong American woman, born and raised here in Fresno. Funny enough, went to Fresno High School, so was very familiar with this area that E&P's office is in now. My story is really much, growing up here, I very much had influences around coming from a refugee family as a result of Vietnam War. And part of that context is then coming to, my parents coming to Fresno and living here. And as far as I can remember in my lifetime, I kind of grew up in this context of never really recognizing if I was poor or rich or fit in or didn't fit in. And I think part of that was just a result of where I lived, who I engaged with. And it really wasn't until I moved out of Fresno at 18, went to school in Southern California, spent 12 years there, and came back in about mid-2022 and took on a role at the foundation that it really kind of allowed me this opportunity to shape out histories of Fresno and narratives around Fresno. And part of shaping that history and narrative is how are we telling that story and sharing that story while giving space for other people to kind of draw their own conclusions and begin to kind of like shape their own narratives and stories as well.
Awesome. My name is Jaeden Herms. I'm not originally a Fresnan. I come by way of Canada, and that usually comes with stereotypes as well. So I've been in Fresno since 2014. Prior to that, I did grow up for a time both in Canada, the UK for a little while. My dad did a PhD in Durham, and then moved to Seattle, and that's where I kind of grew up. That was my first taste of kind of an American life. And that's really where kind of the journey starts for me. The experience that I had growing up as what until recently I wouldn't have called myself as an immigrant, really sort of, it took a lot of unpacking. And like I said, I haven't really referred to myself as that very often. It hasn't been until the last couple of years, and especially since getting into the Facing Fresno work, where you really start to realize the experiences that I had were not unique to people that also have come from the outside and then try and figure out a way to kind of live their life here. but they are a little bit more unique to somebody of my skin color. And so I grew up kind of with this awareness because of who my family is, and kind of the higher ed model of life that we've kind of lived for a long time. I kind of grew up with the awareness that things were kind of off and that racism existed, and especially for Black people, it was very kind of visceral and very tangible. But it wasn't until I left the country kind of on my own in college. I lived for a little while in Vietnam, and it was my study abroad trip that I kind of realized that the racism that I knew about was a much bigger kind of monster that I hadn't experienced. And it wasn't until being in Vietnam and going to My Lai and then going to Cambodia and seeing the atrocities there that you start to really uncover kind of some of the ugly truth. And then coming back to Fresno then kind of during the pandemic, with the murder of George Floyd, but also then, kind of having grown up and gone to college here, you pull back the layers and you start to add the context into like, why am I seeing the world this way? Why do some people have a great time and some people don't? And so I was really excited to come alongside Julie and start to kind of expand on my own knowledge and understanding, because it's a continuous journey, and I'm just excited to be embarking on it. Yeah.
So we've referenced a little bit before I want to go wide in a little bit here, but like before we do that, tell us exactly we've mentioned Facing Fresno, like what is it? What is the project? What's the aim? Just so we can lay that foundation.
Yeah. So the big kind of, overarching elements to Facing Fresno was that the Community Foundation is doing community economic development work. And part of doing this work was that for the longest time, local communities, local governments in particular, have always done this work, but never really taken the moment to fully understand what is this community, what is this place. And what the Central Valley Community Foundation did was that through the work of Fresno Drive, which is a 10-year collective impact initiative, really focused on economic development, human development, and neighborhood development. The goal was that in order for us to actually do all this development, could we actually get to a shared understanding and a shared analysis around the impact of racism? Those are philanthropy talk, right? That's very philanthropy terms. At the core of it was really, can we create something that folks can tap into to understand how racism has shown up in Fresno and how it has actually shaped Fresno. And really shaping Fresno is really done through policy and decision and or indecision, right? So when we talk about investment versus divestment, and so that work is all of Facing Fresno. The name itself actually borrows this term from the work of Facing History, Facing Ourselves, which is national curriculum that is for young people to be able to learn about hate, bias, racism, all forms of isms. And it's this context of we really have to just face what's happening in our community, and that it is an active, right? So it's a verb. We are asking people to do it all the time. And maybe not even asking, but encouraging and having the door open in that context. But ultimately, it's this attempt to be able to have conversations about race and racism and have conversations about how we have been shaped by them and how we also actively shape it.
That's so good. For context, I think as I sit in this spot now, EMP was launched as a service organization. Like that was our original. We did Saturday sports, and we would go into a neighborhood and be like, hey, their roof needs to be fixed, or their some of the homes we went in early on, like they're on dirt, like there's not even a foundation, right? And so it's like, we're gonna get some volunteers to put this together. I mean, that's the heart people with a heart who want to do something good, right? And that's how a lot of nonprofits start. Over the years, I think that shared understanding and deeper pulling on I always talk about pulling on a thread, because we just began to go okay, we're going into these neighborhoods of poverty. Why is there not a grocery store here? Why are the streets clearly not as paved, as well maintained? how come access to maternal health, like there's not a clinic or a doctor around this place, right? And starting to ask those questions, like the understanding, I think it's a growing national city awareness of like the impacts of race and racism. But I think even as an organization and as people, like that's been a slow thing that's, I think, growing, that we're saying, hey, there are underlying factors that have caused our neighborhoods, our communities to get this way. And so I think this is a moment that, I don't know, I just think it's a really important moment to have Facing Fresno actually try and bundle that up in a way that other people can understand. You did mention, you said something about shared histories or shared narratives of Fresno, and it wasn't singular. It's a plural term. Say more on that.
Yeah. So part of that is recognizing that this shared history element of it, right, is that there are multiple communities in Fresno. And when we say stories and narratives, stories essentially, in my perspective, right, are very much shaped by what gets documented, what doesn't get documented, as well as the ways in which oral history is passed down, right, from family to family, generations to generations. And all of those stories are very much rooted in the fact that the author gets to be the person who owns it, right? And that's how it lives on. And for me, narratives are much more rooted in this notion that the media, the public, plays a role in shaping that narrative. And so when we think a lot about how stories are told and shared, there's much more truth to it because you're actually talking to the author, whereas narratives are, spouted through what we are experiencing, right? And that what we are engaging with. And so I think about this a lot in terms of one of the best ways that I've have learned about not just racism, but maybe bias as a more like larger context term is that it is the smoke and the air that you breathe and you inhale that you don't recognize it. And narratives are shared with us through the messaging and what we consume and what we engage with without us even recognizing that. And those two elements can play a really big role in understanding race and racism. And particularly in Fresno, I think there has been this narrative of Fresno as a place in which people shouldn't move to or shouldn't, come here. And there's narratives that
The
exist.
butt crack or
Exactly.
armpit of
The
California.
armpit of
Yes.
California.
Yeah. But then it's like you haven't taken the opportunity to actually get to meet the people and hear their stories.
I think it'd be really important for us to take a minute and define some terms. So if one of you want to tackle it, but race, just as a term itself, and then racism, and then the systemic part of that.
Well, I think the first thing to kind of discuss the term of race is to clearly state that race is a made-up idea. It is a human-constructed, and you can kind of get lost in the academic language of it's a social construct. Okay, cool. It just means that somebody was trying to do research and they made up a way to put things in boxes, right? And that's based on the color of your skin. And basically, and to kind of put it back into the terms of Facing Fresno, what we try and do is show people that just to give them the ability to say, if it's made by a human, it's probably not a perfect system, first and foremost. And so that kind of takes away some of the scary nature about race. Then we kind of, to go into the power thing, we kind of, each of these terms is sort of connected in kind of the curriculum that we give. So how race and how power added to this idea of race and white supremacy added to these ideas, how these kind of all create racism, right? And that's ultimately what we're trying to get at. But to start with race, it's just the idea that based on the color of your skin, you're categorized, and that was a scientific decision by somebody back in the 1800s.
Yeah, it's a term that's really, it was an economic term. Race was invented to create economics, is to sell people, right?
Yep, exactly. It was and to get more specific, it was to allow for the dehumanization of a group because they would have categorized people from the African continent as an underdeveloped human species and therefore not an equivalent human species. And then you can turn a profit on that person.
Yeah, and I would just add the element that when we talk about race and racism, like there is this very like we must also mention these terms of white supremacy and anti-Blackness, and those are high-level terms, and maybe for some of us it's not high-level. I don't want to assume that about all the listeners, but essentially we don't go heavily into white supremacy or anti-Blackness. However, we do make a note in recognizing that this Facing Fresno work is very surface level, and there's invitation to dive in and kind of do more learning. With hopes that we even have like a 2.0 version, 3.0 version training. And I only bring that up because as the data tells us, right, because we're so data-driven in everything we do, is that at the core of it all, anti-Black racism is still like a number one perpetrator around why racism exists. And that when you go into places like Fresno or Detroit or Memphis or New Orleans, by and large, the Black community is the most disenfranchised communities in those neighborhoods, even though they make up a majority of the population and so forth. In our context in Fresno, they don't make up the majority, right? We know in Fresno it's highly Latinx. However, the Black community here is still the most disinvested of the entire community. And on the flip side of that, I think the white supremacy element to it is getting us to recognize that we are a nation that has been built from these values of what is a white person, a white community wants to do and how you can prosper. I think some of those values still live on, right? This podcast won't dive into that, but ultimately, I think there is like deeper layers to this, to really breaking down race and racism. And in one of the videos we used during the training, they end it with saying that race, while has been socially constructed, has had real social impacts and implications on people's lives. And so we can't just factor out race and say people aren't, doing better, being better, and that's because of their race. But the reality is that you have all this pressure and stereotypes placed upon you already based off what you look like.
And we also need to leave space for, pro-Black is also a really great thing too. Like just saying that you're, acknowledging that race is more of a social construct than a biological identity doesn't also need to take away from the fact that you can be really proud about your Blackness or your whiteness if it's, carefully considered, I think, and well aware, but that it needs to be looked at more carefully. And treated with the right respect.
I think it's one of the awareness as, a leader who like runs an organization and is trying to be in this space. Like every person has to, like, even that you mentioned a little bit, Jaeden, of your own kind of journey of, I'm kind of an immigrant and I've experienced some things. Yeah. Every person has to go on a racial identity journey.
Totally.
I think leaders that don't then are afraid of these conversations, afraid to open their eyes to also see the impacts. Like I first saw the impacts in Fresno and then was like, wow, okay, if I just was born somewhere else in this city, I would have a very different life experience than somebody else. But I still had to do some like personal reflection. What is my family story? Do I have an identity, right? Like I think the journey is to invite everybody to say, hey, this is your story and then this is our city's story. What has surprised you that you've learned about our city? Like, what are the things that you keep coming back to and you're like, oh, wow. Or like any interesting, people, groups, history elements, like what kind of continues to rise to the surface as you've put together this curriculum?
I guess if I had to think about what is the thing that like gets me, like that really shocked me or that I'm consistently thinking about, is just this like this way, the way in which Fresno has sprawled. And I know there's a conversation happening right now around sprawl in Fresno, but I want to talk about this really strange period between 1955 to like 1970 something, where it was like major hubs just being built one right after another. And it was very much like, oh, wait, did anybody, like who's processing this? And as residents, are you understanding and seeing why that's happening so quickly? For example, it always shocks me that Manchester was actually built before Fulton Mall. Though we talk about downtown as like a city center, and the history does start that, there's a Fresno train station, and then the division of the train station between West Fresno and downtown and all of this, right? But that we do see Manchester created first and foremost, and then later Fulton Street or Fulton Mall.
Because that Fulton was trying to get them to come back downtown.
I didn't uncover that part of it,
okay.
But that just shocks me because I think about it and I'm like, since then we've had so many like Fashion Fair, River Park, all these major kind of hubs.
I know Dan, I was going to say Dan hit on that in his podcast. So if you want to listen to Dan, we started to ask something about housing. He goes, well, in 1892. Really he like also codified it around like single family home zoning just became the thing. And so every development out was just single family housing, which also has hurt our city. Sorry, Grace.
No, I'm just thinking about our listeners, and I'm thinking about people who work in nonprofits or are just of good faith and goodwill. And a lot of us are fixers. Some of us are recovering fixers. And maybe we're listening to this podcast and we go, what do I do? Or I would love us to like dive a little bit into this like the prejudices that we hold that we don't even recognize that we hold sometimes. What you guys would say about like how we can identify them, acknowledge them, and then also what does it look like to get involved in this work without being a fixer, especially if you fix things all the time in your work or in nonprofit world. Or does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I'll share quickly, and then Jaeden, please chime in because I feel like I'm talking a lot. One of the things that you said, Andrew, that is like true to this content and this training and initiative is that self-work. And in my own kind of like training, one of the educators that I look to a lot is Gloria Latson-Billings, who wrote a lot about mirrors and windows and education being a space for mirrors and windows. And I think of this work, and when she says mirrors, right, she means like, how do we see ourselves reflected and how do we don't see ourselves reflected? And that through that, what learning do we have to do in order to, just be aware and use that awareness for good? And then she also talks about mirror, right, that education has to also be a way for us to be able to see the world. That when we can see the world and we can meet other people and hear their life stories and who they are, and their families and how they've been shaped, that also kind of draws us closer to like a connected community and that young people can be connected to their schools. And so when I think about Facing Fresno work, that is something that I aspire to do, and that it is training and content and initiative that can bring folks together to talk about race and racism without having to get into some really intensive, really high-heated arguments for sake of that. But rather that there can be a dialogue. But I also want to be very mindful, right, that I'm also not trying to bring someone into a space who is completely like a KKK. That's just not reasonable. And so for me, there has to be this like good balance between all of that. And then when you talk about the fixer piece of that, I think when we can start with ourselves and kind of recognize that, we can then begin to build our avenues of like, I don't have to be a fixer. I'm staying in my lane and I'm doing this piece of it. And then your last question around how do we actually do this work and what are like the steps 1, 2, and 3. So theory tells us that whenever you can have contact with somebody who doesn't look like you, and it could be any kind of contact, that actually brings you much closer to dispelling your prejudice and your biases. And that, that yes, if your contact was controlled and it was done in a space of like a dinners across differences, even better. But the fact that your exposure to different communities is going to like tenfold make you that much better to kind of combating your biases and your prejudice.
That moves us in towards one another. It doesn't push us away, from other people. That requires that you move your body. Or move like the proximity piece of like, that might mean that I go somewhere for dinner that I don't typically go to dinner. Like it's as simple, right, as that sometimes.
Well, and that's one of the things, the built environment in Fresno literally separates us.
Right.
And so we are geographically divided as well as racially and economically. Like economics is just much of a factor here too. And so like we're literally not in space with people that are different than us. Like that, like, I'm as a white guy, I'm saying it wrong, as like that can be a thing that like is literally our divider. And so if we don't have these cross-cultural relationships, I mean, that's one of the joys of what I love doing here at EMP is like you have church volunteers going across town to work with students and hopefully, and we're now more intentionally actually having like a race and culture conversation with our volunteers because we thought eventually they would like, oh, what's going on here? Why are there differences in this neighborhood? That is not always where people go, and the assumptions they make. They can use other things. So, anyways, Jaeden.
I don't know. I feel like Julie covers these things so comprehensively. It's why I'm so thrilled to work alongside her. Genuinely.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah,
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
What's the pushback that you guys see?
Definitely.
Or what are the the feelings of frustration that you encounter?
I think the biggest one that I've kind of encountered, and it's one that I have experienced myself, and it's that life is hard for me too. Life's hard for everybody. Nobody has a cakewalk, And I think we kind of ran into this, and please stop me if I don't want to share things, but we did a training with members of a local school district's staff here in kind of the two cities area. Yeah. And we ran into that pretty frequently, that because there wasn't blatant racism that people had grown up with, and because they had also had difficulty and struggle and nothing had been given to them, that there's kind of this idea that people are using race and the idea of racism to get ahead, right? And I don't know. For me, it really starts with your listening skills. Like, can you sit down with somebody and just listen to them, and try to listen without filling your headspace with your own ideas, and you're just trying to take it in. And then I think from listening, for me, it goes to how do I treat people, and how am I a good friend, and that one is kind of the next step. And then that's followed by where can I show up. And when you start showing up to places, usually you've done a lot of work to get there, and you start to be a little bit more ready to get involved. And I think it kind of follows that natural progression. But for me, it 100% starts with, can I listen to the narratives that challenge my own? And we ran into that a lot when we did that training. It was just, even the coworkers that were sitting with each other that would look around the room when we said something, and there's half the room that's nodding their head, and there's half the room that's not nodding their head, because there's clearly an experience had on one side that's not been experienced on the other. And I think that starting to notice those things is really kind of what starts to break down the barriers.
Can I name something very specifically in that
Please.
training? So it was this notion of race shouldn't matter because we're all human. And I bring that up because I think that is, for some people, it's something that they come across and they just recognize that we just want to do good in the world. And I don't want to discount those people. But I go back again that race does matter because it has real social impacts. And in this training particularly, they were talking about themselves. They were talking about the young people they worked with. And they were just like, you're young and you shouldn't, you shouldn't have to worry about these things. And it's like, we wish that was the case if young people actually got to walk out in the world and be themselves rather than be profiled because of their race. And I think that was the point that we were making for them. And some people totally got it. Some people didn't. And I think ultimately this kind of goes back into what kind of inner work is happening that's priming you to actually do this work. Because I think for those who were in disagreement, this might have been the one or two or third time that they've ever been exposed to this type of training. And that's okay. I don't blame or shame or anything. But I do think it is a starting point and that we work from there.
Yes. You have to believe that something like redlining is real.
Right.
That it actually happened, that there's data, that there's history behind it.
And one of the benefits of doing the training and having curriculum that you can go look at is you can literally look at the fact. You can actually go and see, this is Fresno's Hulk map, the homeowners loan corporation, right? Like you can go and see that. And when you see it and the red areas correlate, right? And I saw a stat. This is one of the things that stuck with me as I was researching for our curriculum was 60% of those redlined areas are still areas of low income today. And I think that is
it's an incredible stat.
It. Yeah. That pretty much is where the buck stops for me. As far as data and what we need to.
That's like an 80, 90-year trajectory that is built into the soil.
We're coming up on 100 years here, It's been a while.
Yeah. I think, the conversation always gives me like so much hope in one way because there's like using your mirrors and windows. There's so much opportunity now with podcasts, with books. Yeah. You can learn and I can peer into somebody's world like that I have no sense of, but I can listen and be invited in and have my compassion, my understanding can grow. And also there's so much fear and there's so much political, and I think even in the church world, like we encounter this a lot where it's like, Jesus' blood covers everybody and everybody bleeds red, and it's like, okay, that's the same, it's the same sentiment.
But there's also nowhere more segregated than on a Sunday morning at church.
I was going to ask you, Jaeden. I know you and your parents have participated and are members of St. Rest, a historically Black church in Fresno. What has that experience been like? Like, why? I think your dad preaches, or has some formal role. Like, I don't know. Speak a little bit to that.
Sure. Yeah. I've been a member at St. Rest this is, I think, is it 7 years? Yeah, it's either 7 or coming up on 8. So since college and kind of embarking on my own personal spiritual journey, since then, my dad has come along kind of alongside the church in his role formerly at FPU, and he's now the teaching pastor at St. Rest. So he kind of he does the Wednesday night Bible studies and kind of ministers to the ministers a little bit and is kind of the guy that has all the books on the shelf. You know what I mean? Yeah. And it's been, it's my home. It's not something that I went to go and find an experience to change my life and then I could move on. I was attending another church in Fresno. Pastor DJ, whom you know, shows up, and he shows up pretty big, right? Yeah. And so he showed up, preached this sermon that I was like, I think I know why the Old Testament talks about joy now. And I know why my faith proclaims that it's joyful. And it wasn't something that I had really felt before. And so I went and asked DJ if I could show up, and I've kind of been going ever since. So yeah, it's coming up on 7 or 8 years now.
So did you drag your dad there?
It wasn't dragging. It wasn't dragging.
No. But I'm saying like that's your initial connection.
His connection to the church was through attending occasionally because I was a member there.
That's cool.
And then his personal relationship with DJ, as DJ's kind of been around the FPU. And then the Jeffersons are also super connected in to FPU community as well. And so just kind of the natural the natural connections and family you build, and that's kind of how that's evolved. Yeah.
I think what's interesting is like the Christian sacrament of unity. We can sometimes confuse with like we're all one. It doesn't like the age phrase I don't see color. Hoping to, but because we're one, we're one. Which I love that you like say I'm not going there to experience something and leave. I'm going because it's my home.
Yeah.
And that's out of that genuine, authentic place of the actual sacrament of unity, as opposed to like performative unity, or believing that like, we don't have to, I'm just going because, I don't see color. It doesn't sound like that's out of that place whatsoever.
Yeah, it should never be from a place of like, I want to have been seen in sort of these like cross-cultural or transcultural communities. If you don't feel ready to go, you shouldn't go. You know what I mean? Like
good.
You're taking, and not that you're taking up space, but you are kind of inputting yourself in a place that you're really not ready for. And I don't think that's good for anybody. And that's why I think I mentioned friendship earlier, because having friendships is really where you start to, like, I would not be at a Black church if my best friend, James Glenn, hadn't told me about being chased by a truck in Wenatchee, Washington by a group of white guys. Like I wouldn't be there. And it's because I've had friends that have like helped me sort of understand these really difficult things that I'm even like able to show up, right? Yeah.
What are the ways that we can engage? So I know there's a website. I know there's some trainings. If folks want to learn more about Facing Fresno, I hear there's some word about a Spanish version or some Train the Trainers coming. How do people learn more?
Yeah, so I think multiple things. The website is facingfresno.org, which I know it'll be put into the podcast somewhere or in the description. And that's really, I think, if folks are just interested in understanding and learning about it on a firsthand before you sign up for anything, that is a great place to land and just to read through. It is also where our kind of bread and butter of the history lives. And that's open source. You can go on there, look at it.
So great.
See the citations, use it for what you may want to use.
You have a long timeline, right? So folks that haven't been there, there's like this amazing timeline.
There's like 100+ events.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And it really kind of overlays, U.S. history to California history and then to local Fresno history. Other ways to get engaged is definitely a training at this point in time. The only training we have scheduled is a Spanish one on November 6th and 7th. And it's the training's been split up into 2 days just to kind of accommodate community. That's at our foundation. We'll post it up somewhere and on the website and you'll see it. We hope to also expand to offer more trainings at this point in time. I'm really the only primary trainer, and so we're trying to make sure that Jaeden's skilled up enough to do it. Kate, who's our other Facing Fresno fellow, is also skilled up to do it. And then we also are trying to build a strategy to invest in a few organizations to be able to be trainers and then for them to, do it with their communities. At this point in time, we're also open to requests from organizations. However, that is highly dependent on the availability and your capacity. And I think overall, the other element to kind of just getting involved with this kind of work would be that the foundation and Drive has a really good opportunity where we host what we call innovation events, and it's a way for our community to come learn about information, new research, a book, an author, anything. And I don't know when this will be posted, but our speaker coming this month is Maria Hinojosa, who is an award-winning Latina journalist who has really like paved the way for what does it mean to be Latina, and then also someone who has strong vested interest in media and journalism. And going back to that whole piece of stories and narratives and how she's been able to tell her story and shape narratives in that way. And so she's coming on October 30th to Tower Theater. And that's also open invitation. And ultimately, I think at any point in turn, we want you to get engaged, but we also want you to take the content and use it for your needs, right? Like, what is it that you want to engage with your staff on, or your young person, or this classroom of juniors, or anything like that, right? Like, we really want folks to take it and see it as a resource, and that this is like one of the bare minimum things that a community foundation can do.
Mm-hmm. Wow. What an overview. Yeah. Wow. I feel like I know this is just a bite-sized piece of what you guys do, but I'm really grateful for your guys' presence and your willingness to share, especially we're just 20 days away from an election, y'all. But
who's counting?
Is that the next episode?
counting?
You want to get into that one next?
Yeah, that'll be next. But it is, I hope that people, if you're a Fresnan or live in the area, like, to use the resources and
if you're not, I think like this is like you said, this is innovative.
Yeah.
To, I think, really, you're never going to get, I'm sure, Julie, you get hit up all the time. This isn't included. But like, you've done so much work to try to I really love the, shared understanding, shared narrative, because if we can't agree on our current reality and how we got here, it's really hard to move forward together. And I think like it's trying to orient all the change makers to say, let's start here. Let's acknowledge some of these truths, some of these realities that have caused the what we see as our present reality, and so that we can work together. So I think as somebody who's active in a lot of these conversations, to have a resource, to have a website, to even we've started embedding some of this stuff in our, just like 101s. Like we met with students. They're going to be serving at elementary schools in Southwest. We had Marcel, Tiffany, Artie, and another speaker come and just give like, what have they done in Southwest? What's the history of Southwest? Mm-hmm. So that as they're, with these kids, like they can have a larger imagination. They also know some of the pain, some of the reality. Yeah. Like this stuff has to start even for those folks being change makers. So thank you so much. We'll make sure to link to Drive, your innovation events, because those are ongoing all throughout the year. And then, if you're an organization, I know EMP and CCT, we're doing a training here in November where all of our staffs are going to get trained and go through Facing Fresno. So we're excited about it and glad to be a part of the work. So thank you for all the time and the energy.
Thank you for hosting the space for these types of conversations and for the work that you guys do too. Yeah, you guys are incredible.
Yeah. And 100% thank you, because I think like we are always also trying to figure out what is the exposure piece of this work, because right now it is very, who's connected to CVCF, to Drive, et cetera. And like our hope is that, we can land some interviews with our local partners and make that exposure a little bit more. And I also want to like give a very big shout out to like the folks who helped make this happen. So this work, by and large, is funded by the James Irvin Foundation, who continues to like invest in us to do good work in Fresno. It's also been the content and curriculum have also been greatly influenced and informed by two consultants that I brought on. So Dr. Victoria Navarro Benavides, as well as Dr. Matt Matera. And then like we had this incredible graphic designer who's out in Portland, and she just is like at the intersection of justice and design, and Gabby Turda, creative. Really like she, I was like amazed by this, because I just gave her, I was like, here's our meeting, our 1 hour Zoom meeting. And I'm like telling her all my ideas, and she would come back with the best images. And I'd be like, oh my gosh, I need you as a personal designer for me, just me, not the foundation, not Drive. But I do think like all of that is very much a curation of who are we putting in spaces to help shape this work? And then as well as like who is putting the money behind it, right? Because the foundation is a nonprofit at the end of the day, right? Yeah. And I think we're trying to do good work, and we also know that we are much more resourced compared to other folks and organizations. So being mindful of that and recognizing like, again, understanding ourselves and where we sit at and how we do this work instead of going out and just being fixers all the time.
Well, check out Facing Fresno and don't be afraid. I think that's the biggest thing that I always like. Don't be afraid to delve into topics that feel uncomfortable, spaces that feel uncomfortable. You're going to grow and you're going to be better for it. So.
A little courageous humility.
Amen.
I like it.
All right. We'll join you next time. See y'all. Thanks for tuning in. If you want to find out more about EMP, you can visit us at everyneighborhood.org or follow us at EMP Fresno. Every Neighborhood Partnership and this podcast exists to activate, equip, mobilize, and transform here in Fresno and beyond. If you liked what you've heard, please share and review what's good in the neighborhood wherever you listen. We'll see you next time.